The road leading to the house twisted through dense, leafless woods, as if nature itself hesitated to reveal what lay at the end. Emily Bradford, 32, tightened her grip on the steering wheel as the tires crunched over frozen gravel. Vermont's March was unforgiving. The cold bit through wool and reason alike. She'd driven through snow before, but today the frost seemed to echo the quiet weight in her chest. The house appeared as a silhouette first. A gray stone mansion, too large for comfort, too still for life. Windows stared blankly through thick curtains, and the black iron gate creaked open with a mechanical groan as if reluctantly welcoming her. She parked the car and stepped out, adjusting the collar of her coat. The air smelled of pine and old wood, and something else, less discernible. Her boots sunk slightly into the slush as she approached the entrance. 2 knocks, a pause, and then the heavy door opened. Miss Bradford, a tall man in his 60s, dressed impeccably in a black suit, nodded solemnly. "Welcome. I am Malcolm." "Pleasure," she said softly, eyes drifting past him into the cavernous foyer. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. "Is Margaret here?" "She is resting. I will show you to your room." He led her through silent corridors where every footstep seemed amplified, each creak of the wooden floorboards echoing through the stillness. Portraits stared down at her with cold, oil-painted eyes. Ancestors, perhaps, or ghosts with titles. The room prepared for her was functional, yet impersonal. Ivory walls, a bed with iron posts, a wardrobe that smelled of mothballs. She placed her suitcase on the edge and turned to Malcolm. "And Aiden?" she asked. His expression didn't change. "He is in the sunroom. I will take you to him when you're ready." Emily nodded, but didn't sit. "I'm ready now." The sunroom was a misnomer. No sun reached through. The gray clouds and the frostbitten glass panes, but it was brighter than the rest of the house. In the center of the room, surrounded by medical equipment and untouched toys, lay Aiden, 10 years old, pale, small for his age, a breathing tube, a feeding line, his eyelids unmoving, a child without motion or sound, as if time itself had abandoned him. Emily stepped closer, heart clenching. Her throat tightened as she saw him more clearly. Something in the angle of his face, the shape of his lips, reminded her of her own son. Her own son, Dylan. Dead just 4 months. She pressed her hand gently to Aiden's, cold, limp, but human, real. Her fingers trembled as she whispered, "Hello." To Aiden, "I'm Emily. I'll be here now." From the doorway, Malcolm watched. He hasn't moved in over a year. Emily didn't turn to him. "I know what stillness looks like. I know what silence feels like, but I don't believe in absence." Malcolm said nothing. Behind him, the ticking of a distant clock marked the only passage of time. Later that evening, Margaret appeared, dressed in dark green velvet, her silver hair in a tight bun. She looked every bit the matriarch of a fading empire. Her cane tapped rhythmically on the floor as she entered the parlor where Emily sat reviewing medical notes. "You've read the file, I assume," Margaret said without greeting. "I have. Glasgow Coma Scale, 4. No speech, no movement. Doctors say recovery is unlikely." "They always say that," Margaret replied, voice as cold as the walls. "Hope is a poison, Miss Bradford. I don't keep it in this house." Emily met her eyes. "Then I'll keep it for you." A long silence passed. "You lost a child, didn't you?" Margaret asked, but her tone wasn't kind. Emily's jaw clenched. "Yes." "Then you know what grief does. It digs into your bones and never lets go." Emily looked down. "It also teaches you to listen, to things people don't hear anymore." Margaret scoffed, turning away. "You're here to keep him alive. Nothing more." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was still in the sunroom, still with the boy who didn't move. A boy whose chest rose and fell, whose heart still beat. She would find him in that silence. Even if no one else believed he was still there, even if it destroyed her. The routine began without variation, like an old clock, out of fashion, perhaps, but still ticking with relentless precision. Every morning at precisely 7, Emily stepped into the sunroom where Aiden lay. Her tasks were methodical: check vital signs, ensure the feeding tube was functioning, and begin the passive physical therapy, gentle movements for joints that had long stopped receiving commands from the brain. Movements done not for hope of motion, but to keep atrophy at bay. The boy gave no response. Still, she spoke to him, always softly, always calmly, as if her voice could penetrate some invisible fog. She began with small talk, the weather, snippets from the radio, fragments of her past. Then she read aloud, choosing simple, happy children's books with bright endings, clinging to the naive belief that such tales could somehow reach the dormant part of him that no scan could find. But the silence remained. It was a thick, suffocating silence, not only in Aiden's condition, but embedded in the very bones of the house. Emily felt it strongest during meals, when she sat across from Margaret, and occasionally, Malcolm. There was no conversation. Margaret limited herself to short, clipped comments about the tea or the frost outside. Malcolm, ever composed, answered questions with single words, never volunteering more. It felt like the entire household had entered into an unspoken agreement. Emotions were not welcome here. Time itself felt frozen. The curtains were rarely opened. The paintings on the walls never changed. The scent of waxed wood and dried roses lingered endlessly. Emily began to feel as though she were living inside a portrait, a still life, caught between a lost past and a future that refused to come. Sometimes, while brushing her hair in front of the mirror in her room, she barely recognized her own reflection. The eyes no longer sparkled, the skin had paled, her shoulders sagged under the weight of something far heavier than fatigue. But what struck her most was the hollowness inside, a familiar void. It was the same void she felt when she woke in the hospital and was told Dylan hadn't made it. Her son, gone, 4 months ago, taken by a sudden aneurysm. She remembered the sterile light, the flat line, the way his small hand grew cold in hers, saying goodbye when she still expected him to open his eyes and whisper, "Mom," one last time. That grief still hummed inside her, a raw frequency no one else could hear. And now, here was Aiden, not Dylan, not really, but something, a reflection, a fragile, unmoving echo of the boy she couldn't save. Maybe that's why she couldn't walk away. Emily began adding small touches to the house, gestures not part of the official medical protocol. A portable radio that played soft lullabies, a notebook where she wrote short, made-up stories, then read them aloud by his side. She started humming songs from her childhood while organizing medication trays. She watched him for hours, observing the subtlest tremors of his face, searching for something, anything that might suggest he was still there. And then a thought crept in. What if no one in this house wanted Aiden to wake up? The notion was disturbing, ridiculous. But once it entered her mind, it wouldn't leave. She began to scrutinize Margaret's behavior more closely. How she never touched the boy, never sat beside him. How her eyes lingered on Aiden with something colder than grief. When Malcolm tended to equipment, he did so with the detachment of a technician, not someone who shared space with a living child every day. And the medical care, it was outdated. No new assessments, no follow-up imaging, no curiosity. It was as if the house, and everyone in it, had decided this was the end. They were simply waiting for the body to agree. But Emily couldn't accept that. Margaret had accused her, once, of projecting. "You're not seeing him," she'd said with icy finality. "You're seeing what you lost." Maybe that was true. Maybe she was projecting. But that didn't mean she was wrong. One afternoon, while arranging books on a shelf in the sunroom, Emily noticed something odd. A small wooden airplane, handmade, sitting on the window ledge. It was dust-covered, clearly forgotten, yet placed as though it had been left there just recently. She didn't remember it being there before. It wasn't on the official list of patient belongings. She picked it up, brushed the dust away. A chill traced down her spine. She turned around. Aiden hadn't moved. Not a twitch. But, for a moment, she felt it. A presence. A flicker. As if something had just shifted in the room. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was waiting. For something. Or for someone. It was on a Thursday afternoon. Gray and uneventful, like the dozens that came before when Emily witnessed something that could not, leave her. The kind of moment so brief and delicate it might have been imagined, if not for the sheer weight it placed on her chest. Like a sudden gust of wind against still glass. She had been changing the bed linens, humming an old lullaby, one she used to sing to Dylan when he had trouble falling asleep. Her hands moved automatically, tugging the corners of the fresh sheet, smoothing the folds, tucking the blanket with a familiar maternal grace that felt both painful and instinctive. Aiden lay as he always did, unmoving, pale, distant. His chest rose and fell with the help of machines. His eyes closed, his body unresponsive. But Emily, standing by the side of the bed, leaned over to adjust his pillow. Her fingers brushed the boy's temple as she straightened the pillowcase, and just as she was about to step away, she saw it. He blinked, once, a single, slow, deliberate blink, one eyelid lowering and lifting, as if pulled from the depths of some unreachable place. It was not an involuntary twitch, not the random movement of nerves. It was unmistakably purposeful, measured, present. Her breath caught. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her hands hovered in the air above him, the edges of the sheet still between her fingers. Time, the still suffocating time that filled that house like fog, fractured in that moment. Cracked. Aiden's face returned to its immobile state, his expression unchanged, his body quiet as always. But Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. She waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. And still, she knew what she had seen. That evening, after her duties were done, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a cooling cup of tea she hadn't touched. The walls around her felt tighter, the house colder. Across the room, Malcolm stood silently at the counter, polishing silverware with detached precision. Margaret, as always, read a book with unreadable focus, her spine rigid, her fingers unmoving even as the clock ticked behind her. Emily stared at the candle in the center of the table. It flickered faintly, its wax melting into shallow puddles, and she considered how fragile a flame could be, and yet how stubbornly it burned. "I saw something today," she said finally, breaking the silence like glass underfoot. Margaret didn't look up. "Something," she echoed, her tone already skeptical. Emily nodded slowly. Aiden blinked. Now, Margaret did look at her, her gaze sharp, assessing, cold. He blinks, occasionally, reflexes. "No," Emily said, her voice low but steady. "This wasn't that." He looked at me, and he blinked. The older woman stared for a long, uncomfortable beat. Then, slowly, she closed her book and placed it on the table with deliberate care. "You're projecting," she said with a level of certainty that dismissed not only Emily's statement, but her right to make it. "It's common, after loss. You see what you want to see." Emily felt a sting rise behind her eyes, but didn't allow it to surface. "I know what I saw." "You saw your son," Margaret said, almost with pity. "Not mine." For a moment, the room felt colder than ever, not because of the winter outside, but because of the words, like blades, subtle and precise. Emily lowered her gaze to her tea, now cold and untouched, and said nothing else. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by Aiden's bedside, wrapped in a shawl, the room lit only by the dim glow of a night lamp. The machines beeped and whirred, each sound painfully familiar. She held his hand, not as a nurse, but as a mother. Not because she was told to, but because she needed to. Her fingers traced the tiny creases in his skin, his wrist so small and delicate beneath her thumb. She stared at his face for hours, waiting, watching, but the blink did not return. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Emily's routine resumed: feeding, movement exercises, temperature checks or charting, and with each task, she found herself watching him more closely, memorizing his expressions, cataloging every subtle shift, even when logic told her there would be none. Days passed. Then, one afternoon, a quiet one, when the house had gone so still it felt almost abandoned, she noticed something new. His index finger, barely visible beneath the blanket, twitched. A single, isolated movement, so small it might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But not to her. She leaned in closer. "Aiden," she whispered, barely audible. "Can you hear me?" No response. "I don't care what they say," she added, her voice firmer now. "I saw you." She began to test small things. She brought him music through headphones, children's songs at first, then classical pieces, her own favorites. She told him stories, not the ones from books now, but from her life. Her voice would lower when she spoke about Dylan, about the loss, about the pain that still carved through her like winter wind through the forest. And one evening, as she sat recounting the memory of the night before her son's aneurysm, how he'd told her he'd had a bad dream and she'd let him sleep in her bed, she saw it, a tear. Just one. It welled in the corner of Aiden's eye and traced a slow, deliberate path down his cheek. She froze. The air left her lungs. Her hand flew to her mouth, the other reaching instinctively toward his face, not to wipe it away, but to feel it. It was real, salty, warm. A boy who hadn't moved in over a year, who had not responded to any stimulation, to any therapy, to any sound or word, was crying. Not from pain, not from reflex, from memory, from awareness. The house, with its ancient shadows and sealed-off rooms, no longer felt like a tomb. Something inside it was waking up, and Emily was the only one who knew. From the moment Emily witnessed that tear descending slowly across Aiden's cheek, something inside her shifted permanently. Not only her perception of the boy lying, motionless before her, but the way she began to move through the house itself, with a renewed sense of urgency, of purpose, as if the walls had somehow thickened and the air grown heavier, as though the truth she was now convinced of carried a gravity no one else was willing to acknowledge. She began to approach her days no longer with the resigned precision of a nurse following protocol, but with the quiet rebellion of someone unraveling a mystery that no one else believed was even there. And the more she watched, the more she spoke the more she listened, the more she was certain that something, or someone, inside Aiden was trying to surface, not with grand movements or miraculous awakenings, but in subtle, fractured signals, scattered like shards of glass, across a silent floor. She had learned to look for the imperceptible, those faint contractions at the corner of his mouth when she told him stories about places he'd never been, or the way his fingers sometimes curled the tiniest bit whenever she mentioned her son by name. Emily, now writing her observations down in a notebook hidden beneath the mattress in her room, recorded every anomaly, every twitch, every potential sign of response, as if compiling evidence for a case that no one else had. The courage to open, but beyond the physical signs, what grew stronger by the day was her sense of emotional resonance, an almost intangible awareness that, when she spoke to Aiden, especially during the long, whisper-filled evenings when the wind moaned across, the windows and the shadows stretched like black fingers along the floor, he was with her, listening from behind some invisible veil, trapped perhaps, but not gone. And so she experimented, not with medicines or procedures, which she had no authority to alter, but with stories. She would kneel beside his bed and create entire worlds with her voice, tales of children who crossed frozen rivers to find their lost siblings, of boys who rode bicycles into the forest and found secret doors beneath trees, of mothers who fought monsters in the dark to rescue their sons from dreams too heavy to escape. These weren't mere distractions. They were coded messages, small, emotional beacons cast into whatever darkness Aiden might be suspended in, each one a desperate call to his subconscious. You are not alone, you are not forgotten, you are not gone. One evening, as the sky dimmed into that particular shade of violet unique to Vermont's early spring, Emily found herself seated beside Aiden, with headphones gently placed over his ears, playing a playlist she'd curated, a mix of lullabies and instrumental piano pieces she remembered from Dylan's childhood. She sat there watching him, silent, her gaze fixed not on the machines or monitors but on his face, tracing the delicate lines of his mouth, his lashes, the slight indentation on his chin. And then, without even realizing how the thought formed, she began to speak, not to him but to herself, though something inside her believed that every word mattered. I never told anyone what I said to him that night, she murmured, her voice hoarse, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I told Dylan that I needed a break. I'd been so tired. I'd been snapping at him over everything, not sleeping. Not eating right, just breaking in ways I didn't want to admit. And he looked at me with those eyes and said, "It's okay, Mom, I'll be quiet for you." He said it with a smile, like he thought it would help. And that was the last thing he ever said to me. A sound, soft and nearly imperceptible, emerged from somewhere in the room, not from the machines, not from outside, but from Aiden. Emily's eyes snapped to him. She leaned forward. There was a twitch, no, a tremor in his lip. And then, slowly, another tear welled in the corner of his eye, trembling there for a moment like a drop of rain on glass before it fell, tracing a line along his temple and into his hairline. Emily's breath caught again, her pulse racing, not from fear this time, but from something far more dangerous, hope. She moved closer, now kneeling, resting her hand lightly on his forearm. "You heard me," she whispered. "Didn't you?" No response. But she no longer expected one, not in the way others did. She had learned to hear him in the stillness. That night, back in her room, she wrote down everything, every second, every movement, every word spoken and tear shed, documenting it with the precision of a scientist and the desperation of a mother. But she also wrote something she hadn't dared commit to paper before. He is in there. I don't know how I know, but I do. The following days brought more fragments, more signs that, taken alone, might seem meaningless, but together formed a pattern that only she could see. His fingers moving during certain melodies, his eyes fluttering when she used particular phrases, a slow exhale when she mentioned his parents. It became clear that there were triggers, specific emotional keys capable of unlocking pieces of Aiden that had long been hidden. And more than that, she was beginning to understand which ones mattered. But what haunted her most, what kept her awake long into the night, wasn't the signs themselves, but the thought that if she was right, if Aiden was aware, listening, feeling, then every minute he spent ignored or dismissed by those around him was a kind of quiet torture. The idea of being trapped in a body that refused to move, in a house that had decided you were no longer worth waiting for, with only the echo of footsteps and the cold touch of machinery to remind you that you hadn't yet died, it was unthinkable. And yet, if Emily's instincts were correct, that was the prison Aiden was locked inside. One evening, a storm rolled over the hills, covering the sky with heavy clouds that swallowed what little light remained. The power flickered once, then twice, before going out entirely, leaving the house in a strange, humming silence. Emily made her way through the corridor by candlelight, guided more by instinct than vision. She reached Aiden's room, finding him bathed in the faint orange glow of a lantern she had left beside his bed, sitting beside him, listening to the rain tapping steadily against the windows. She said softly, "I know you're in there, Aiden, and I'm going to find a way to bring you back, even if it kills me." And though there was no reply, no movement, no sign that her words had landed anywhere but the air between them, she stayed by his side long after the candle began to fade, believing, no, knowing, that within the silence, something had already started to stir. The storm lingered for days, as if reluctant to move on, wrapping the mansion in a persistent veil of rain and wind that scratched against the windows and seeped into the crevices of the old stone walls. The electricity flickered on and off, never fully stabilizing, forcing the household into dim lighting and cold air, adding yet another layer of stillness to a home already suspended in quiet despair. The sound of footsteps on wood echoed more loudly. Doors creaked with deeper groans, and every candle that Emily lit seemed to burn too slowly, dragging time into a lethargic crawl that matched the mood saturating every corner of the estate. Emily, by then, had grown used to the rhythm of the place, the heavy silences during meals, the dutiful yet distant presence of Malcolm, the way Margaret moved through the house as if nothing could surprise or affect her. But on the third night of uninterrupted storm, something shifted, not in the air, but in the behavior of the old woman who until then had remained a figure of unyielding control and disapproval. It was late, well past midnight, when Emily, unable to sleep and still charged with an undercurrent of nervous energy from the subtle changes she continued to observe in Aiden, stepped out into the hallway, drawn not by sound, but by instinct. The same instinct that had first told her the boy was still present beneath the surface of his condition. She found Margaret in the garden, or rather, what remained of it, standing beneath the shelter of a crumbling stone arch near the rose bushes, holding a crystal glass with trembling fingers. The rain had softened, now more of a mist than a downpour. And in the faint light of the house behind them, Margaret's silhouette appeared almost fragile, her figure draped in a heavy shawl, her silver hair slightly undone from the bun she always kept impossibly tight. There was something unsettling about seeing her there, not because of the late hour or the drink in her hand, but because for the first time, she seemed out of place, no longer the master of the home, but simply a woman shaped by grief and time. Emily didn't speak at first, unsure whether to approach or retreat, but the decision was made for her when Margaret turned her head slowly, revealing a face far less composed than usual. The tightness that had always lived around, her mouth had softened, and her eyes, red-rimmed and glistening, no longer carried the steel that Emily had grown to resent. Margaret didn't look startled to see her there, nor did she offer any of her usual curt acknowledgments. Instead, she stared out into the darkness of the garden and began speaking with a voice that was quieter than Emily had ever heard, almost brittle, as though the words had been pressed into her throat for far too long. She spoke not of the house, nor of the silence, nor even of Emily's presence there. She spoke of the night that changed everything, unraveling a memory, so raw that it hung in the air between them like fog. The story came slowly, in waves, but without hesitation, as though it had always been waiting to be released. It had been a day like any outro. Calm, routine, no premonitions of disaster. Aiden had been playing in the driveway with his bicycle while his parents prepared for an evening flight. One of many they'd taken before, always business, always urgent. There had been a disagreement, not an explosive fight, but one of those simmering arguments that leave a residue in the air, born from months of tension, from conflicting ideas about raising a child, from the strain of balancing family. With ambition, Aiden had heard it, of course, children always do, and afterward, he'd withdrawn, retreated into himself, as if blaming his own existence for the discomfort between his mother and father. Later that afternoon, Margaret had caught a glimpse of him riding too fast down the driveway. Helmet askew, face pale and tight with whatever emotion a 10-year-old doesn't yet know how to articulate. The accident had been sudden and brutal, a collision with a stone wall near the edge of the property, a snap of metal, a crack of bone. His body had been limp before the ambulance even arrived, and yet that had not been the end of the tragedy. His parents, refusing to delay the flight, had left for the airport as planned, convinced that the boy would recover, or that their absence would not change the outcome. Hours later, the plane crashed into the ocean, killing everyone on board. Margaret had been left with everything and nothing: the house, the accounts, the weight of decisions made too quickly, and the screams of guilt that never stopped, even when no one else could hear them. She admitted that she had never truly forgiven herself, that part of her believed Aiden's silence and his unresponsiveness was a punishment, not for him, but for her, for all of them. A silent condemnation from the one person who had been too young to understand the consequences of that day, and yet was forced to carry them in his small, still body. She confessed that the months following the accident had been filled with visits from doctors, specialists, experts from all corners of the country, all offering possibilities, none offering hope. The most optimistic ones had spoken of minimal consciousness, while others had quietly suggested chronic vegetative state behind closed doors. Eventually, Margaret had stopped inviting them, stopped asking questions, stopped allowing herself to believe. And that was why she had grown so cold, so fiercely defensive of the status quo, because if she allowed even a sliver of hope back into her life, it would be like reopening a wound that had never truly closed, risking the collapse of the careful numbness she had built to survive the years. She had become a guardian not of Aiden's life, but of the silence, the space between grief and possibility. And now, Emily's presence, with all its quiet defiance and stubborn tenderness, had begun to shake that silence loose. Margaret didn't cry, not in the way one might expect, but as she tilted her glass slightly, staring into the rain-soaked earth of her garden, her shoulders trembled with something deeper than sorrow, with shame and exhaustion, and an acknowledgement that perhaps she had failed the one person who needed her the most. When Emily finally returned to her room hours later, her clothes damp and her heart heavy, she realized that something irreversible had occurred. The house, once stagnant and unmoved, had begun to breathe again, its grief exposed not through haunting or chaos, but through the unraveling of a woman who had spent years pretending that stillness was safety. And now, with Margaret's walls beginning to crack and Aiden offering silent fragments of himself to the surface, Emily knew that this story, all of it, was only just beginning. The morning after Margaret's unexpected confession arrived, not with clarity or resolution, but with a thick, weighty stillness that wrapped around Emily's thoughts like fog on a wintered field. Though the storm had finally moved on, leaving behind damp soil and dripping tree limbs, the house itself seemed unchanged, still cloaked in that same dull quiet, still pulsing with the same measured mechanical sounds of the machines that kept Aiden's body alive. But for Emily, something fundamental had shifted. The narrative that had framed her understanding of the boy's condition, once painted in sterile medical terms and clinical prognosis, now carried the stain of grief and human fault, and that changed everything. No longer was she caring for a child rendered still by fate alone. She was tending to the echo of a family tragedy, to the living proof of guilt and silence, and she could no longer remain simply an observer inside the structure of rules and routine. In the days that followed, Emily's resolve hardened not into rebellion but into precision. She began to document Aiden's behaviors even more rigorously, creating a private system for measuring subtle responses that others would dismiss as mere involuntary muscle contractions, the barely there twitch of a hand when she used certain intonations, the faint elevation in heart rate during specific pieces of music, the minute change in his breathing pattern when she whispered his name after recounting stories of her own son. It was as though she had become attuned to another language altogether, one built on silence and the micro-movements of a body in exile. And although no one in the house dared to speak of it, not even Margaret, who had since retreated back into her cold, distant composure, Emily knew that what she was seeing was not imaginary, nor grief-induced delusion, but the quiet unraveling of a consciousness returning, one fragile fragment at a time. And yet the medical establishment, remained indifferent. When Emily called the specialist in Boston, whose name appeared in the original file, and explained her observations in careful, clinical language, avoiding any emotional embellishment or suggestion of intuition, she was met with a polite but dismissive tone, the kind reserved for professionals considered overly optimistic or too emotionally involved. The doctor, clearly well-meaning, explained the likelihood of residual neural activity, the statistical irrelevance of isolated motor responses gone, and concluded with the familiar mantra, continue with supportive care, but be careful not to create unrealistic expectations. Emily thanked him, hung up, and stood by the window for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the distant tree line while the anger bloomed in her chest with a steady burning throb. She realized then that no one was coming to help. No reassessment would be ordered. No specialist would drive through the hills of Vermont to evaluate a child already deemed unreachable. And so she turned inward, not into despair but into action, deciding that if no one else would see what she saw, she would have to become both caretaker and investigator, nurse and advocate, scientist and mother. She spent her nights reading everything she could find about nonverbal responses in children with traumatic brain injuries. She found obscure studies, niche articles, forums written by desperate parents, and experimental methods used in research hospitals abroad. Some of it bordered on pseudoscience, but much of it aligned eerily with what she was already experiencing. That emotional memory and sensory stimulation could reach deeper into the mind than logic assumed, and that connection, especially through familiar human voices, could act as a catalyst even when all other systems appeared dormant. It was during one of those long nights, as the house slept beneath its usual hush, that Emily first attempted something she hadn't yet dared, a technique used rarely and cautiously, one she'd read about in a trial conducted years ago involving patients in states of minimal consciousness. She placed a pair of soft, wireless headphones over Aiden's ears and began recording her own voice, not reading to him, not narrating a story, but speaking to him as a mother would to her child, telling him about memories, feelings, dreams, secrets she'd never shared aloud. Her voice trembled at first, not from fear but from the strangeness of the intimacy, from the vulnerability of offering something so personal to someone who might never respond. And still, she spoke. She told him about the final hours of Dylan's life, not the sterile hospital version, but the quiet, unbearable human version, about how she had brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead, pretending to be strong when every bone in her body had fractured under the weight of knowing he would never wake. She told Aiden about the silence that followed, the unnatural quiet of a home without a child's footsteps, and about the way the light in her kitchen changed color after that, colder, flatter, forever touched by absence. She told him about how she had stopped singing, how she had packed away every toy and book with surgical detachment, and how she hadn't looked at a photograph of her son in weeks because she no longer knew if it was healing or punishment. Her voice faltered, thickened, but she didn't stop, because as she spoke, something within her began to unfreeze, and she sensed, though she could not explain why, that something within Aiden might be thawing as well. She repeated this routine for days, sometimes switching to music, sometimes playing old lullabies, but always returning to the voice, her voice, because that was the only thing in that house that carried emotion. Unfiltered, unguarded, Malcolm noticed. He said nothing, but she often caught him pausing outside the door, listening not to Aiden but to her, as if something about the cadence of her words, the sheer devotion behind them, stirred something long dormant in him as well. And then it happened. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sun slanted low across the sky and the house was bathed in gold that softened even its hardest edges. Emily had just finished another recording, her voice still hoarse from emotion, and was sitting beside the boy, holding his hand with the calm familiarity of someone who no longer measured time in hours or minutes, but in breaths and glances. The machines hummed their usual rhythm. The room was quiet. And then, unmistakably, undeniably, a sound broke through. A low, strained, Broken whisper. Ma. Ma. Emily froze. Her heart began to pound so violently she thought it might tear through her chest. She leaned in, barely breathing, eyes wide. Again, slower, more pained, but clearer now. It came. Ma. Ma. Not a word. Not even a syllable formed with confidence, but a sound, shaped by effort, forged in the deepest part of the throat, pulled upward through resistance that had held him silent for over a year. Emily fell forward, pressing her forehead against the edge of the bed, tears coming fast, not out of sadness or release, but out of awe, the kind of awe that only arrives when the impossible folds itself into the real. Because in that moment, with the room soaked in amber light and her hand trembling against his, she understood beyond doubt that Aiden had heard everything, not just the recordings, but her, every story, every song, every word she had whispered in the darkness had been received, not lost, not wasted, but felt. He had been with her the whole time, and now, finally, he was trying to return. The days that followed Aiden's first fragile attempt at speech existed in a kind of surreal haze, not because things had changed in some dramatic or visible way. The house still creaked with age and memory, the corridors still held their shadows, and Margaret still moved through them like a ghost unwilling to leave. But because everything Emily did, from the moment she opened her eyes in the morning to the last whisper she gave him at night, was now charged with a new kind of energy, a trembling certainty that the impossible had already begun to unfold. Aiden had spoken, not in full words or confident sounds, but in a broken murmur that bore the weight of intention and awareness, and that single vocal fracture was enough to alter the entire framework of her world. She no longer questioned. Whether he was present, she knew, and with that knowledge came a deeper, more urgent responsibility, to make others see what she saw, to break the barrier not just between Aiden and the world, but between truth and disbelief. But disbelief had roots in that house, thick, tangled roots woven over years of disappointment and defensive numbness. Margaret, who Emily thought might have softened after her confession in the garden, had instead receded again into her practiced silence, as if afraid that even the hope of progress would open old wounds too deep to survive a second time. She said little when Emily tried to explain what had happened, offered no resistance but also no curiosity, only a weary glance that communicated more than words ever could. Don't make me believe again. Malcolm, however, proved to be less impassive than he had first seemed. One morning, as Emily was preparing Aiden's breakfast formula and organizing his medications in the clinical quiet of the sunroom, Malcolm entered without a word, carrying a small black leather folder. It was the first time he had done something unscheduled, unprompted, and his presence, though calm as always, carried a subtle tension, a stiffness in the way he clutched the folder, the way he avoided her gaze as he placed it gently on the edge of the table. Then, without preamble, he turned to leave, but something in Emily's voice stopped him. "What is it?" she asked, not sharply, but with the gravity of someone who sensed this moment had been building in secret for longer than she had realized. Malcolm paused. He looked at the folder for a moment and then, for the first time since she arrived, he truly looked at her, not through the lens of professional distance, but with the eyes of a man who had been keeping something locked inside for far too long. "I thought it might be time you saw for yourself," he said. When he left the room, Emily sat down and opened the folder with a slow, steady hand, her heart already bracing for what she didn't yet know. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, neatly organized, dated and timed, not hers, but his. Observations made over the past several months, perhaps longer, documenting what could only be described as the same subtle responses she herself had been tracking. Changes in breathing, occasional facial movements, rapid eye fluttering. In response to sound, isolated twitches of fingers and toes, all noted with the precision of someone who had seen and doubted, then seen again and begun to believe. But more startling than the notes were the USB drives tucked into a small envelope attached to the back cover, labeled only with dates. Emily rushed to her room and connected the first drive to her laptop, her hands trembling as the files opened. They were video recordings, hours of footage. And within the grainy light of the sunroom, she saw herself, reading, singing, whispering, laughing and crying beside Aiden's still form. But what made her knees weaken was what she hadn't seen in real time. In several of the videos, especially the later ones, there were unmistakable signs. Small shifts of muscle, minute changes in his eyes, flickers of awareness that the camera caught even when the human eye might not have. And there, in one recording from just 2 weeks earlier, as she read him a story from memory, he turned his head, not dramatically, not fully, but enough for the motion to be real, enough to confirm everything. She watched hours of footage that day, losing track of time, unable to pull herself away, her emotions moving between vindication and fury, because Malcolm had known, perhaps not from the very beginning, perhaps not with certainty, but he had suspected. He had observed. He had kept it to himself. Later that night, after Aiden had been fed and repositioned, after the machines had been checked and the doors locked against the cool wind outside, Emily found Malcolm in the kitchen, standing alone at the sink, washing a porcelain teacup with slow, meditative movements. "You recorded everything," she said quietly, and not with accusation, but with the heaviness of someone who had just come to understand the scale of what had been hidden. Malcolm didn't turn around immediately. When he finally did, he dried his hands with a white linen cloth, folded it precisely, and placed it on the counter before speaking. His voice was low, composed, but lacking the usual emotional detachment. "I did," he said. "I watched, I noted, and I recorded because I didn't know what else to do." He explained then, not in long dramatic monologues but in deliberate, measured statements, that he had begun observing changes in Aiden many months ago, but had been under explicit instruction from Margaret, not to engage, not to encourage any belief in recovery. She had insisted, with the iron will only she possessed, that to hope was to suffer, and that the kindest thing to do was to let silence remain unchallenged. Malcolm, loyal to a fault he lies had obeyed why, but something in him had rebelled in silence, and so he documented, preserving every moment he thought might someday matter. "I wasn't brave enough," he admitted, his eyes avoiding hers. "Not like you." Emily wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to demand why he hadn't come forward, but part of her knew why. This house had become a tomb, not just for Aiden's consciousness, but for the emotional lives of everyone who remained in it. Margaret had buried her guilt, Malcolm his doubts, and Emily, until recently, had buried her grief. None of them had escaped the weight of the past, but now, the boy at the center of that silence was stirring, and nothing could remain buried for much longer. She left the kitchen without another word. The folder of evidence clutched to her chest like a sacred text, and returned to Aiden's. "Sir." As she looked down at him, his face peaceful, but no longer unreadable, she knew what she had to do. The truth would no longer remain hidden in private recordings or quiet notebooks. She would bring it to light. She would make the world see him. Because Aiden was no longer lost, he was returning. The decision to act did not come with ceremony or dramatic revelation, but rather settled into Emily with the same quiet certainty that had governed her every instinct since the day she arrived at the house. A resolve not born of desperation or impulse, but from a deep, unshakable conviction that the truth, once fully unearthed, could not be ignored or undone. After watching the recordings, after tracing with her own eyes the irrefutable signs of presence and response that had been captured again and again, she knew there was no space left for hesitation. For weeks, perhaps even months, Aiden had been trying to find a way back, not in the sudden, miraculous manner that fairy tales promised, but through small, painstaking gestures, fragments of self rising slowly from the depths of his unconscious mind, each one reaching for light, for sound, for the familiar touch of a world he had never truly left. Emily no longer measured her success in signs easily catalogued by machines. Instead, she began structuring her days around deliberate, consistent stimuli designed not only to awaken his cognitive responses, but to reconnect him with the rhythm of time and memory. She introduced visuals, family photographs placed strategically near his line of sight, images of places she knew from Malcolm's notes had once been part of his routine. She began reading the same story multiple times over a period of days, embedding the pattern of narrative and tone, then altering key details to see whether his expressions would shift. She found that he responded more to the timbre of her voice than the content itself, that a certain pitch, soft, close to a whisper, intimate and warm, elicited more subtle movement in his brows and lips than louder speech ever had. And slowly, beneath the clinical ritual, beneath the weight of years spent in silence, the boy began to return. It happened in increments, like the slow thaw of a lake beneath spring's hesitant sun, not visible from a distance, but undeniable to the one who stood close enough, long enough to feel it. His eyelids fluttered more often, not randomly but in correlation with specific stimuli. His fingers began to curl, not reflexively but in rhythm with music she played for him. There was a faint tremble in his jaw when she spoke to him about Dylan and a noticeable increase in his breathing when she described things that evoked fear or love, emotional triggers, she realized, that transcended the coma and accessed a deeper layer of awareness. But it was when she laid her hand gently against his cheek, skin against skin, and whispered his name, not just once, but over and over, like a mantra, like an invocation, that she saw the clearest sign of all. His eyes opened, not fully yao, not with the strength of someone waking from a restful sleep, but with the hesitant, blinking effort of someone resurfacing after a long submersion, eyes squinting against the light of a world too bright, too loud, too unfamiliar. She did not cry in that moment, not out of restraint or disbelief, but because everything inside her became utterly still, the kind of stillness that arrives only when the soul recognizes something sacred and irrevocable. She sat there, in silence, afraid that even the sound of her own breath might break the fragile bridge now forming between them. His gaze, unfocused at first, drifted toward the ceiling, then slowly, painstakingly toward her face. And though his eyes held no expression, no smile, no spark, she felt in that gaze the weight of memory, the echo of recognition, the first fragile thread of return. The hours that followed were a blur of motion and quiet exhilaration. Emily contacted the neurology team, bypassing Margaret entirely, sending the video evidence and logs directly to the specialist she had spoken to weeks before. At first, the response was polite but skeptical, tempered by the same caution that had defined every medical opinion since the accident. But within days, a new team was dispatched to Vermont, not out of hope, but out of the kind of clinical curiosity that arises when data contradicts assumption. When they arrived, Emily stood firm in her presentation, refusing to soften, the details to leave emotion at the door. She showed them everything, the videos, the notes, the audio logs, even the recorded whisper of Aiden's voice struggling to say, "Mama." She saw the shift in their posture. The moment theory gave way to possibility. Aiden was reevaluated with fresh eyes and newer tools. And for the first time since the accident, the medical language surrounding him changed. Words like non-responsive were replaced with minimally conscious. Terms like persistent vegetative state gave way to evidence of cognitive awareness. The house, once thick with static despair, began to hum with a cautious energy, as if the very walls had been waiting for permission to feel something again. And Margaret, though still silent, still watchful, no longer turned away. When Emily entered the room, no longer dismissed the progress or questioned the reality of it. Something in her had shifted as well, not softened, but cracked just enough to allow the truth in. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing one, Aiden's responses became stronger. He began tracking sound with his eyes, following light, reacting visibly to changes in tone and touch. The medical team adjusted his regimen, introducing new therapies in WoW, and Emily, now formally appointed as his lead caregiver and rehabilitation coordinator, worked alongside them, no longer a stranger in the house, but the quiet axis around which Aiden's world began to rotate. She was the one who knew his rhythms, who understood his silences, who could anticipate his needs without needing a monitor to alert her. And slowly, painstakingly, she helped guide him back to a place where words were not impossible. The first time he sat upright, assisted, braced, his muscles weak but no longer inert. The room filled with a silence so powerful it nearly drowned out the noise of machines. Emily stood beside him, one hand gently supporting his back, the other resting lightly over his heart, feeling the thrum of life not as theory but as presence. Aiden's head tilted slightly toward her, and though he still could not speak, his lips parted, and his eyes, clearer now, steadier, looked at her with something unspoken but understood. It was not gratitude. It was not even awareness of all she had done. It was something purer, connection. He was no longer buried beneath layers of silence and forgotten memory. He was alive, awake, and, finally, beginning to return to himself. The transformation that unfolded in the weeks that followed was not marked by any singular miracle or sudden leap forward, but rather emerged as a gradual and deeply human progression, one composed not of spectacular moments fit for headlines or dramatic retellings, but of quiet victories accumulated through persistence, repetition, and a growing communion between two souls who had both survived the unimaginable, one from the edge of death, the other from the chasm of grief. Emily no longer operated under the guise of professional detachment. What bound her to Aiden now was no longer her contract, nor even her sense of duty, but something far more elemental, the intimate recognition of shared pain and the instinctive, an unspoken need to protect the fragile reawakening of a boy who, day by day, rediscovered the very architecture of being alive. The house, once an echo chamber of resignation and controlled routines, slowly began to breathe in a rhythm that matched Aiden's recovery. Though its walls remained lined with dark wood and its corridors steeped in silence, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a new kind of quiet that did not stem from emotional frost but from concentration, attentiveness, a waiting no longer passive but full of intention. Mornings became rituals of stimulation and training, light therapy, tactile exercises, voice repetition, visual tracking. The team of specialists, initially hesitant in their projections, began to discuss timelines, goals, and phases of reintegration, language that had long been absent from any conversation surrounding Aiden. He was no longer a case frozen in time. He was here now Uwe, a child reclaiming his place in the world, one breath, one blink, one fragile movement at a time. It was during one of those gentle spring afternoons, when the wind carried the smell of thawing earth and distant blossoms from the garden that had been left unattended for so long, that something almost imperceptible shifted between them. Emily had been working with Aiden on hand coordination, guiding his fingers along a soft fabric maze stitched into a sensory board designed for neural stimulation. His hand, now far less rigid than before, responded with uncertain but purposeful movement. And as she adjusted the angle of the board and leaned closer to describe what he was touching, Aiden's other hand, without command or cue, reached toward hers and rested lightly on her wrist, not as a reflex, not as a misfiring of nerves, but with the unmistakable intention of human contact. In that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. It was not the gesture itself that carried meaning. Small hands had touched hers many times before, through both her years in nursing and her years of motherhood. But the fact that this touch emerged not from need, but from recognition, Aiden's eyes, brighter now, less clouded, lifted to meet hers, and in that gaze was not only awareness but something deeper, something more difficult to name, a seed of trust, or perhaps the acknowledgement of safety, of continuity. However, an invisible thread running between them that neither of them fully understood, but both seemed to feel. That evening, when she helped him sit by the window for the first time without full support, positioning pillows behind his back, wrapping him in a warm, knitted blanket that had once belonged to his mother, a detail she had learned from Malcolm during one of their rare but meaningful conversations. Emily noticed that Aidan no longer stared blankly at the outdoors, but followed the birds, tracked the wind through the swaying branches, and blinked slowly as the light shifted across the room, as if reacquainting himself with the color and texture of the world. Progress became more pronounced after that. His vocalizations, once limited to vague murmurs and breathy attempts, began to take shape into phonemes, then partial words. The first time he mimicked the sound of a letter, the specialists praised the neurological significance. But for Emily, it was less about the science and more about the symbolism. The letter D, spoken haltingly, was not a random sound, but the beginning of the name she had whispered countless times beside his bed, Dylan. Whether the connection was conscious or not, she could not know, but the weight of it pressed into her in a way that neither frightened nor saddened her. Instead, it felt like a small reconciliation, a moment in which the memory of her own child and the presence of this boy, so different and yet inextricably entwined in her soul, occupied the same space without conflict or confusion. Margaret, for her part, had begun to change as well, though her evolution was slower, less visible, and riddled with hesitation. She still kept her distance during therapy sessions, still cloaked her presence in a facade of stoic control, but on several occasions, Emily noticed her standing just beyond the doorway of the sunroom, fingers gripping the frame, eyes fixed on her grandson's face with an expression not easily defined, not quite sorrow, not yet hope, but something searching, wounded, and unfamiliar. Once, Emily entered the kitchen late at night and found her seated in the dark, a single cup of tea untouched on the table, her gaze fixed on nothing. Margaret did not speak, did not even seem to register Emily's presence, but her posture had softened, her shoulders hunched not from pride, but from the slow unwinding of a burden she had carried in silence for too long. Eventually, the day arrived when Aidan spoke his first full phrase, quiet, fragmented, but complete enough to be understood. The words themselves were simple, almost childlike in their construction, but Emily would never forget the sound of them, the way they cracked through the silence like sunlight through a shuttered window. "You bringed me back," he said, the consonants uneven, the syntax imperfect, but the meaning clear. She could not hold back the tears that spilled from her as she knelt beside him, her hands clasping his, her forehead pressed gently to the edge of the blanket covering his lap. There were no words she could offer in response that would match the enormity of what he had given her. Not just a confirmation of presence, but a testament of return. And so, in the quiet weeks that followed, as spring began to root itself firmly in the earth outside, Emily found herself transformed as well. She began to study again, not simply medical texts, but literature on neuroplasticity, developmental psychology, trauma, and language recovery. Her nights were no longer consumed by grief or insomnia, but by purpose, by the intricate work of understanding how minds rebuild themselves, how language finds its way back through damaged circuits, how connection, authentic, patient, human connection, could stitch together what medicine alone could not. She no longer dreamed only of the past. She began slowly to imagine a future, not as a substitute for what she had lost, but as something wholly new, raw and uncertain, but profoundly alive. The garden had finally bloomed again, not in the way it had during its prime, when Margaret's husband was alive and the grounds had been meticulously curated by professionals, but in the wild, imperfect way that nature reclaims neglected beauty, with vines creeping over the cracked stones, with wildflowers sprouting, in the spaces between old pavings with soft grass growing where order had once reigned. And it was precisely in that natural disarray, under the filtered gold of a warm late-spring sun, that something extraordinary unfolded with the quiet dignity of moments that change lives not through spectacle, but through weight, the kind of weight that builds slowly from everything that came before it, and then settles like a final note in a long, unfinished symphony. A small group had gathered at Margaret's suggestion, a rare initiative that had startled even Malcolm, who had come to accept the woman's routines as unbreakable as the walls of the house itself. But Margaret, in her own reserved and rigid way, had begun to understand that grief and guilt, when left to calcify unchecked, did not protect. They entombed, and she had entombed herself for far too long. Now, as Aiden's progress became visible not just to those who believed but to those who had doubted, she found herself driven by a need not to celebrate, but to witness, to allow others to witness what she herself could no longer deny. And so the garden, once forgotten, was cleared enough to allow chairs to be arranged in a loose circle beneath the old sycamore tree where Aiden used to play. Long before silence had claimed him, Emily stood slightly apart from the others as the guests, family friends, therapists, physicians, and a few quiet neighbors arrived, their presence marked by murmured greetings and cautious smiles, unsure of what, exactly, they had been invited to witness. Aiden sat in his wheelchair, his posture straighter now, his eyes no longer dull and absent, but watchful and focused, occasionally drifting toward the wind chimes that hung in the distance, catching their movement, following their sound as if memorizing the rhythm of the day. His hair had grown a little longer, curling gently at the nape of his neck, and his skin had regained its warmth, his cheeks holding the faintest hint of color. The boy who had once lain in silence for over a year now moved with intention, responded with nuance, and in moments of clarity, spoke with effort and meaning, not frequently, not easily, but undeniably. What Emily had seen first in fragments, a blink, a tear, a whispered syllable, had now become a full portrait of reemergence, delicate but whole, and she no longer carried her days with the guarded tension of someone waiting for collapse. Instead, she moved with the steady calm of someone who had chosen to live again, not because her pain had disappeared, but because it had transformed, woven itself into the fabric of her presence so deeply that it no longer weighed her down. It shaped her, gave her direction, anchored her in something truer than resolution, connection. Margaret sat beside her grandson, one gloved hand resting lightly on the armrest of the chair, her eyes shaded by a wide hat, her expression unreadable to those who didn't know her, but to Emily, there was no more need for translation. The woman had been changed, not by forgiveness but by proximity to hope, and that hope, once resisted, had finally been allowed in. She did not speak to Emily often, nor did she ever fully apologize, but in the careful way she watched over Aiden now, in the way she allowed herself to touch his hair or adjust his blanket without flinching, there was something better than remorse. There was care. The afternoon unfolded with the slow rhythm of something sacred. There was no speech, no ceremony, no formal declaration of milestones reached. Instead, the therapist spoke softly with guests about progress and potential. Malcolm offered tea and scones with quiet efficiency, and Emily, dressed in a light blue dress she hadn't worn since her son's funeral, sat quietly near, the boy she had helped bring back. Unsure if she was the guardian of his future or the witness to his return, she had stopped trying to define her role weeks ago. It no longer mattered whether she was nurse and guide and or mother figure. What mattered was that she had chosen to stay, and in doing so, had allowed something to grow that neither science nor love alone could fully explain. As the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched softly across the lawn, a gentle wind moved through the garden, rustling the chimes, stirring the leaves, and Aiden, who had remained quiet and observant throughout, turned his head slowly toward the cluster of people around him. His eyes, no longer glassy but full of that quiet, contemplative clarity Emily had come to recognize, searched the space until they found her. He blinked once, and then, with an effort that twisted his lips, tightened his jaw, and filled the air with a sudden hush so complete it seemed as if even the birds had paused their songs. He opened his mouth. Emily. The word came out not with strength, but with depth, as though drawn up from the deepest place inside him, shaped by memory, practice, emotion. It was not a name he had just learned. It was one he had been holding, waiting. To say, waiting for the moment to give it breath. The sound, though broken at the edges, landed in the air with the weight of everything they had endured together. A year of silence, of hope in defiance of evidence, of grief transformed into something more than loss. Every conversation stilled, every movement paused. Emily, who had thought herself prepared for anything, who had witnessed so many small miracles in the form of neural responses and cognitive signs, suddenly found herself caught in the one moment for which she had no preparation. Her chest tightened with something beyond joy, something ancient and fragile, and as she stepped forward, hands trembling slightly, eyes wide and glassy with disbelief, Aiden smiled. It was faint, crooked, effortful, but it was a smile, when it was his. Margaret reached for her mouth, covering it gently, tears sliding down her cheeks without sound. Malcolm, ever composed, stood still by the tree, his eyes lowered not in detachment, but in reverence. And Emily, kneeling beside the boy, resting her hands gently over his, nodded with a voice barely above breath. "I'm here." The garden held them all in its silence, the wind moving like breath through branches, the last light of day casting long lines of shadow and gold across the earth. There were no speeches, no declarations, no applause. There was only a name spoken into the world by someone who had been silent for so long, and in that name, in that single, fractured word, there was a kind of salvation. Aiden had returned, and Emily, once shattered by her own loss, now found herself whole in a way she had never imagined, not because she had stopped mourning, but because she had chosen, despite that mourning, to love again. And in doing so, she had brought him back, and he, without knowing it, had brought her back too.